So welcome everyone again. The recording is now on, and tonight is the introductory session for our Coping with Crisis. We're very fortunate to have a lot of talent in our congregation, and in particular tonight our speaker is Kathryn Harris. Kathryn has been a licensed clinical social worker for 400 years, and she has been involved in not only helping people in our community, but a number of years ago when the tsunami hit in Southeast Asia, she went over and did some important work with families and children and women who were coping with the impact of that crisis. So she has a lot of experience in helping people deal with the unexpected, and I think it's particularly fitting that she would be the kickoff for us this evening. In your Zoom window, if you look towards the bottom, there is a chat feature, and we will be taking questions later. The chat feature is right in the bottom if you just move your mouse down there. If you would like to ask a question, you can click on that chat feature and type in the question that you have. And then when Kathryn's ready for questions, I will unmute you so that you can ask Kathryn that question directly. So that way you don't have to kind of remember the question and keep that from listening to what else Kathryn is sharing, but you can write it down and be assured that we'll be able to tackle it when we open it up for Q&A. So if you have a question though for me, or you're having some trouble with something in particular, you can, in addition to putting the question in the chat feature to go to everybody, you can also just send me a note through the chat feature, just change the name that's in the corner and send it to me, and I'll do my best to answer it. So without further ado, I turn it over to Lady Kathryn Harris. Kathryn, thanks.
Thanks so much, Jeffrey, for all of your help in putting this together, for the idea for it, and for being our tech wizard as well as gracious host. Welcome, everybody. As Jeffrey said, I'm Kathryn Harris. I'm a clinical social worker and I've been in private practice for a number of years, probably over 40 some odd, both here in Lewes and elsewhere. It's my pleasure to be here tonight and to have had the opportunity to reflect on some of these issues. They are weird times. I titled my talk, Coping with Weird Times, because difficult, yes, but it's such a jumble of experience, at least for me. So I hope to give an overview of the many different ways people respond to stressful times and explore with you some ideas on how you might better understand your own responses and offer some suggestions on how you can work with yourself to keep yourself as balanced and whole as possible through whatever you're experiencing in these times. Each of the subsequent sessions will pick up an aspect of these themes, and I'll go over the list of the sessions to come with the presenters so you can see what we're planning for this series. Please know that this is an experiment for all of us using this technology as a means of presenting. Please let us know what works about it and what doesn't. We have 9 more sessions to go after this, and I assume by session number 10, we'll have it down. Meanwhile, thanks for your tolerance of the learning process we'll all be going through. So let's look at what we have been experiencing in the last month to 6 weeks. Some people's lives haven't changed much at all, but many folks have experienced sudden and unexpected change, which impacts many parts of their lives and our lives. There's an apparent threat, but we're unclear how imminent it is. Because of this threat, COVID-19, our lives have been disrupted. We've suddenly had to change how we work, at least I have, how we are with each other, even with those we love, how we conduct even small details of our lives. I've heard folks use such terms as it's a time of uncertainty, confusion, they feel up in the air, ungrounded, strange, challenged, disrupted, threatened. I'm sure you have adjectives that you could add to that. I'd like to take a little bit of time to look at how we deal with change and perceived threat. The mind stays steady on its course amid disruption by trying to maintain life as smoothly as possible. Our mind and body function well if all of the systems are operating according to schedule. This is called equilibrium or homeostasis. The mind and body work together to maintain a state of stability and predictability, to stay balanced and have everything run smoothly. Part of this stability comes from our interpersonal connections that keep us grounded, our routines, daily rituals, and schedules, which allow us some sense that we can predict or anticipate what's going to happen to us. So what happens when routines are disrupted? We tend to experience a disorientation that something is wrong. We may become anxious and either deny a problem or become agitated, seeking out information to be able to reorient ourselves. Anxiety is a built-in feedback system of the mind and body that tells us to be on the alert for danger, that something is very wrong. But it doesn't tell what it is, it just says that something is wrong. It provides us with enough discomfort, usually, to motivate us to understand and try and figure out and fix what may be wrong. Unfortunately, the anxiety itself tends to disrupt other parts of us, which may get out of balance, perhaps sleep, our daily schedule, our support, the way we use our support systems. When one part of us gets out of balance, it throws other parts out of balance. And this is why the equilibrium is so important. So we look for ways to bring ourselves back to center. We look for information to help us take any action we can to protect ourselves and establish a new normal. Many of us have had to reinvent how we do our work. You know, after 40 years of doing this, I suddenly find myself with a whole new way of doing my work. I have a virtual office now. This was something I never anticipated. We have to find new ways of connecting with those we love if we can't, in fact, be with them. We have to find new ways of getting exercise and other just routine parts of our lives in order, since our usual routines and schedules and the ways we organize our lives have been disrupted. This probably feels uncomfortable, inconvenient, and even challenging, especially when it comes to suddenly having to learn new skills, such as the technology we're told can be such a resource in these times. In all of this, we need to know how to soothe ourselves and to know what gives us comfort and when it's important to do this. So let's look a little bit at how we respond to this particular threat, the threat of the the coronavirus or COVID-19. All of our responses and reactions are based on a combination of past experience, intuition or gut reactions, which are usually very fast acting, and slower, more deliberate logical analysis. The fast acting responses usually dominate, especially when we're anxious. It's difficult for us as human beings to accurately assess risk. Indeed, risk assessment is usually based on a perceived threat, my interpretation of what a threat is, rather than an actual assessment of what's out there. So while danger can be very real, risk is a subjective conclusion, which is usually based on judgments, assumptions, and these are based on feelings. So our feelings, our reactions, particularly in the light of threat, are very subjective and based on our biases. With regard to COVID-19, it's also difficult to evaluate the risk of something that is foreign. We've found ourselves suddenly confronted by a pandemic, a word most of us probably haven't even used before. At first, the virus seemed so far away, just another news story about distress somewhere else. And when it started coming closer, the information we got was inconsistent and often conflicting, depending on where we sourced our news. Unfortunately, again, emotion usually fills the gaps when we either have a lack of information or conflicting information. Emotion-based judgments can lead to faulty conclusions, bad judgment, and risky behavior. It's also the case that responses to the outbreak have become politically charged. This tends to reinforce our biases and influence our reactions, whether the reaction be one of threat or denial. We tend to respond by only watching the news that supports what we want to hear and our biases. So all of this says it's hard to know and adequately assess what we're really dealing with here. And we need to be very careful about the decisions we're making and the assumptions they're based on. So in the midst of all of this discombobulation, how do we regain balance? And once we get there, how do we keep ourselves grounded? When parts of our lives seem out of control, we need to be very conscious and intentional. I'm going to be using intentional a bunch, about taking control of what we can. Even the small things. We need to establish routines of eating, sleeping, exercise, and meditation and/or prayer. And we need to keep to them. It's useful to set specific goals for this time and will accomplish them. Examples can include contacting people we haven't talked with in a while, learning a new skill, using all the YouTube videos that can be so helpful, becoming more comfortable working with technology. I think that's a big one for folks of our age. And then there are always house tasks, cleaning closets, taking a stab at the attic, which we've been doing here, or planning some home improvement project, which will require researching and organizing. These can be very satisfying with a sense of accomplishment and that you're taking control of something in your life. At least it feels good to me. Another thing that's really important along with our routines is that we stay connected. Again, be very intentional to regularly connect with those who are important to you, through phone, web resources, or any other means. Reach out from folks you haven't heard from in a while. It's a time when such connections can be very heartwarming. When was the last time you sent a funny card to a friend? Experiment with using technology to help connect. Not only email, but try Zoom meetings if you haven't done so. We've enjoyed a number of Zoom dinner dates with friends and family. In fact, had Easter with our family in Boston and California, and realized I believe it's the first Easter we've all spent together. It was just lovely. And Zoom makes that possible. Zoom also makes possible meeting with book groups. The St. Peter's Book Group is going to meet this Sunday. If you haven't thought about joining us, contact Carol Summers and get an invitation to the Zoom meeting. I've met with 2 other book groups on Zoom thus far in the last month, and it's been lovely to see folks, and we've even figured out how to have a good discussion. Our weekly meditation has established a virtual meditation on our usual Monday at 4. It's great to go and see the faces of those we have been accustomed to meeting with for the past number of years. Community meetings are happening. These are all ways of staying connected with what has been meaningful and will continue to be meaningful to us. So it's worth putting some effort into developing familiarity and comfort in working with this technology, or at least it has been for me. It's important to pay attention and to investigate what's happening both inside and outside you. On the inside, what's happening in your body? Are you aware of particular areas of tension? How are you sleeping? Too much? Too little? Is sleep interrupted? Are you having intense dreams? I know I felt very reassured last week when I read 2 or 3 different articles on COVID-19 dream life, which was not about the virus so much, but it was just that people are commenting upon having really intense dreams, which probably just indicate that there's a lot going on. How are you eating? Too much? Too little? You're gaining weight? You're losing it? Are you having emotional food cravings? Chocolate chip cookies are my go-to. Have you kept to your typical schedule for eating, sleeping, or exercise? Or have you let it slide? Is this something that needs attention? How is your psyche doing? Are you feeling anxious or agitated? Are you aware of being depressed or having low energy and no motivation? Do you find yourself wanting to reach out to others? And if you are doing that, how does that feel? If you're not doing so, how does that feel? And how is your spirit? Are you regularly taking time to read spiritual materials, meditate, or pray? Do you notice how you feel during that process and after doing so? Is it important to you? Important enough to make it a part of your daily life at this time? Have you tuned into one of St. Peter's services broadcast on YouTube channel or the website? A schedule of the services came out on the email blast that came from the parish today. it's really interesting. And even though to me, to see the service take place on my, and so in this, the chapel has become familiar, and I see familiar faces and hear familiar voices speaking the liturgy, which is familiar and meaningful. Do check out these resources. Father Jeff and TJ and all the others have done a really fine job of bringing the services to us. Be aware of what's going on outside you. How much attention are you paying to the news? Are you aware of how you feel while you're watching and listening? Do you need to ration the news and perhaps balance it with something enjoyable and relaxing? I think it's really important to have that balance. I know we find that the news can be very compelling, and yet there comes a time when it gets difficult to sleep. And I know we've had too much of it, or I've had too much of it. How often are you connecting with your support system, your neighbors, family, your church friends? How are your friends and family dealing? What's working from them, for them, and what's not? What can you learn from them about coping with unusual times? Do you feel that you're able to offer support without getting pulled in to their distress? So let's take some time to talk about what's actually happening with you. And I know Father Jeff suggested that you write down some questions, but I'll give you some to reflect on in case you haven't had enough ideas from what's been said previously. So what has been happening with you in the last month? What are you learning about yourself, about your life, and about being here in Lewes? What has changed, if anything, in the past 6 weeks or so? How are you dealing with the change? What do you need for yourself at this time? And what do you need to pay attention to? And how do you think this experience over the last month will change your and our collective lives when we're finally given permission to go out and find our new normal? So those are my thoughts. Let's hear from you folks.
Anybody have a question? You can type it in under the chat feature, or alternately, if you look at the bottom menu bar, there's also a reactions thing where you can raise your hand like I'm doing right now. See, I raised my hand. So either way, when you're ready, anybody have a question or a thought?
Thoughts. Doesn't have to be a formal question. What's been happening with you?
I'm going to unmute everybody now so that if you wanted to talk, you can raise your hand.
I have a question. It's Mary Ann.
Hi, Mary Ann.
You can even raise your hand like this if you can't figure out how to do it on the chat.
Right. Go ahead, Mary Ann.
I think just recently I've begun to figure out that this isn't just something that will come and it will go, and that we'll be back to normal. I think our situation is changing, as you said, completely now. How do you deal with a change that you don't know what's going to happen in the future? How do you hang on to that and just let it go?
How do you hang on to what?
How do you hang on to the present day, everything we've always known, but knowing now in the future, as they talk about opening up businesses gradually, that the world as we've known it is going to change completely. And there's no going back to where we came from. Now, how do you deal with that now that we're up in the air? I think
Other people have suggestions? I think that's going to be kind of one of the topics that we're going to be discussing further, but I think that this is a real important question. Yeah.
Go ahead, Leslie.
Well, what I've been trying to do, which is challenging, is remembering about mindfulness and just trying to be in the moment. Because, as you said, the thinking about the future is so anxiety provoking that I think pulling away from that and just trying to focus in the here and now is really helpful.
I find that going out for walks on one of these lovely spring days and seeing the spring flowers is incredibly present tense. Doing whatever we can very thoughtfully in this moment, whether it's sharing a meal with a loved one or walking the dog, just staying with what's happening, being in the body, and knowing that we can't predict the future, not that we ever could, but we delude ourselves into thinking that we can predict the future. And now we're suddenly being confronted with the fact that we can't. So know that we'll deal with what comes down when it comes down. I think that's one, for me, that's one of the advantages of getting older, because I know that I deal with things. I don't have to like them. You know, in my 75 years, I've learned that I can, I deal with what I'm confronted with. So that's a knowing that I didn't have 30 years ago, particularly. And I think that's an advantage that those of us of a certain age have.
Kathryn, Leslie had another question for you too, about schedules and being accountable. Leslie, did you want to ask?
I don't want to be the only one talking here, but
Please feel free.
I'm a teacher by training, and so I understood at the beginning of all of this the importance of setting up a schedule, and all my teacher friends did that for their kids, and I thought about it for myself, and I got so far as that a couple of times with pieces of paper, and then even very broad schedules like creative time, reading time, news time, and I still can't keep to that. So how does one make oneself accountable to one when you're willing to give yourself so much slack?
I do two things. One, I decide what's most important, and that's what I put on my list. And the second is that I need to report to somebody. I met with a group on Zoom this afternoon, just two buddies. We used to have a photography studio together, and we're getting together once a week on Zoom and holding each other accountable for tasks that last week I said I was going to do. And indeed, none of us did tasks this week, but we all had good reasons, and next week are going to need to report. So having accountability usually means reporting to somebody, and have a buddy who you say, yep, I did my exercise, I did, you know, I ate, I slept, but being clear, what are the most important pieces of that schedule? Probably regular sleeping, regular eating, exercise, and then add on from there. But know what your bottom line is. But I think that's a real important question.
Great. Thanks, Kathryn. I think Jackie had a question for us too. Jackie, I'm trying to unmute you, but you have to unmute yourself. There we go.
Sorry about that. Henry was barking.
No problem.
I too am used to living, I lived by the bell for 31 years. Every 50 minutes, the bell rang and something happened. And it's been really hard for me to adjust to an unstructured time schedule, because for me, I need people. That's my accountability. I love being around communities of people. And Zoom is great as far as it goes, but it doesn't really fill that void for me. And so I'm trying to figure out ways to fill that void, I guess is the best way I can think of it. And it's been very challenging. That is for sure. Anyway, any hints? I know that the last question was very similar to this. So,
Well, what do other folks do when they're feeling a need for that kind of interpersonal contact?
Donna Ledbetter?
Right. I was bemoaning the fact last week that I didn't get something done. I have all the, time on the weekend. I'm still working too, so I don't have completely unstructured time. But I was really fussing at myself for not getting things done. And thankfully, my sweet husband said to me, Donna, what's the big deal today if you don't do anything? And, if you don't accomplish some of those things, what's going to happen? And I said, well, I don't know, but, I'm not supposed to be just sitting around. I was, I had parents that were always claiming that you get all your work done before you rest. And there's always something to do. But I have found that to be, when Tom said that to me that day, I kind of relaxed into it and thought, maybe I can be just self-compassionate and just give myself permission to be in the mood I was in that day, which was not productive at all. And I'm sure I needed to investigate what I was feeling, but I just didn't feel like doing things and being structured. And he kind of helped me get permission to just let it be, and that was helpful. So that's the other side of it.
Eleanor, you were going to share something?
Well, it's sort of redundant now that Donna talked. I also had a schedule. I started out with a schedule, which I never followed. I had to give myself permission, and now I had to give myself permission for a while not to do anything. And then when I started getting productive, I had to realize I didn't have to do it every minute of the day. So I'm trying to recognize those times that I'm down and just give myself a little space. And then I come around and then I start being productive again. So it's a balance between being too busy or doing what I need to do for myself, or just letting me realize this is a mess and it's going to affect me.
Thanks, Eleanor, and thank you, Donna. I think I'd add one more thing too. I mean, back to Jackie's bend on the question too about feeling a little socially isolated and Zoom being a poor substitute. It is. I mean, it's just not going to make up for the interactions that we have with people when we're able to be with people. But we can try to push the envelope as much as possible. I mean, I have a friend I know who's playing Yahtzee with her friends on Zoom. And it's an easy game to play as long as you both have the Yahtzee thing. Cards are more problematic because you can't, share a deck, but you can find things that you can do. The other thing I would encourage is to try, if you're feeling the need to connect, then take the opportunity to connect and call your friends or call and check on people. It's amazing, I think, sometimes the things that when we feel that we need them, when we start doing them for others, suddenly we find that need gets fulfilled for ourselves as well. And I think George and Molly were going to share something. George, didn't you have
No,
your hand up?
it's Molly.
Oh,
Hi.
okay, Molly. Go ahead.
Couple of things, actually. It's not really a question, but more an observation that many of us who are in the retired population have very different concerns and lifestyles than those people who are being laid off from their jobs. So we have, if we are accustomed to connecting with people in our giving back times of our lives, and we are cut off from that, then there's a huge void there. But I find that at the end of the day, I'm very grateful that it's spring, that we can get outside, that we can plant our gardens, and that at the end of the day, if I just have one thing to say that I showed for my existence today, then I feel at peace. Amen.
You know, Donna, I realized when you spoke that what I neglected to add to my piece was the need to be gentle with oneself.
Mhm.
That is so critical in awkward times. And so thank you so much for raising that, because I think that's the basis on which we can move through this.
Other
Thank you.
questions? Ted, did you have your hand up? Oh, Ted, let me unmute you. Go ahead.
Okay, he makes the mute speak. How wonderful.
You'll have a hard time living that one down.
I really will.
Oh, wait until you hear me talk, and then you can say he also makes the dumb speak. Anyway, I'm just going to make an observation too in terms of the situation that we're in. It seems to be this endless tunnel that we're in. We don't know when the end point is, and I think and actually the truth is that's true for all of us in our lives. We really don't know when our end date is, our sell-by date. We do not know what that is. So I think sometimes just kind of what's helpful for me is kind of thinking making it more into bite-sized pieces in terms of the day or the week, and not casting my line out too far. And I think kind of bringing it back, one of the things that's been helpful is the kind of the routine of daily prayer, which I will confess has not been something part of my regular spiritual discipline, but just kind of getting into that idea. And I almost kind of feel like I'm discovering my inner monk. I want to run off to a monastery or feel like I've been living in a monastery of sorts. But it does kind of help to kind of have to recognize that there is a rhythm to the day. You know, there's a morning, an afternoon, an evening, and a night, and then it returns again. And that's an old kind of sensibility that people of faith, well, all folks have had for a long time. You know, we build our lives around days and seasons and years and so forth. And I think this time has been, for me anyway, a time to kind of return to that kind of sensibility or that awareness that there is a rhythm to the day. It's not SSDD, same stuff, different days, but things are kind of just, there is a rhythm, and kind of pay attention to that rhythm in the day, within myself, the energy or whatever it is. Some people do well in the morning. Evenings are not a good time for me all the time. That's when I notice a kind of a slump. Other people notice that in the morning, but paying attention to those kind of rhythms and being more, I guess you might say, mindful about what's going on within me, and recognizing that that kind of a rhythm is something that living into is something that I've kind of like ignored with all the pace of life up to this point.
Thank you, Ted.
Thank you.
Anybody else have a question or a thought? Oh, come on in,
What
Sherry.
do you think is going to be
Well, you know,
different?
oh,
Yeah, help yourself.
okay.
Go ahead, Sherry.
I do have a thought in terms of, and I'm wondering if anybody else has this as well, as when things might get back to somewhat normal, and that is when there's a vaccine. So when there's a vaccine, you know, like I'm sure all of us remember back in the day when we had our smallpox vaccine or our polio. Oh, that was a big deal in that time frame. But I just think that when I have a vaccine, that things will be safe. But until then, they're not safe. So I was just wondering if anybody else had that thought about that's when it's going to happen. I see Jackie bobbing.
Yeah, I think vaccine is one thing we're all hoping for, but in the meantime, you know, we're going to have to try to keep track of ourselves and try to be able to test and determine where the spread is going currently so that we can kind of constrain it. But the vaccine ultimately is the best solution we can hope for. Tracy.
I just have a comment in that vaccines are not the ultimate answer, because they'll come up with a vaccine for this one and there will be another one. So we have to kind of accept the fact that as human beings, we're going to have to constantly be aware that we have to adjust to things that change in our lives. One of the things I think that this event has forced upon us is a return to an almost simpler time when we spent a quieter time, more family time, more time connecting with one another. Because we can't run around and worry about jobs or, you know, whatever else we were doing. Good things, I'm sure, but the point is we were doing more of them than we probably needed to do. But I don't think a vaccine is going to be a panacea for any of this.
Mark, you were going to chime in?
Yeah, Tracy, I think just hit on one of the things that I think is going on here, which is that this has raised a kind of a serious chink in the armor kind of thing, where we sort of realize, at least I realize more than usual, that we are less powerful than we thought. We are less in charge than we thought, and I think you know, the new normal may include a bit more humility about things not being totally in control, and I think there'll be some benefit to that, but it certainly is going to be very different. And it makes me nervous at this edge, although I think we can work through it. We can get through this to whatever the new space is. It's just not going to look the same, I don't think. And as Tracy says, you know, the vaccine will certainly help, but actually, it's actually kind of useful for us, I think, as a people, to deal with what the rest of the world already knows, that we're not actually in control of everything. Mm-hmm. And therefore the business, the recommendation about dealing with what you can and letting the rest just go is really, really helpful. You know, sort of, Jeffrey sent out something earlier today to some of us that's where it sort of said, you know, you can, when it's raining, you can sit around and make all kinds of complaints about the fact that it's raining. Or when somebody says it's raining, you say, yep. And you sort of move on to whatever's next. You know, we're in quarantine, yep. And you move on to whatever's next. But you don't say, and it'll never rain again. No, it's just, you know, you don't get to do that one. But you get to deal with, yeah, that's right. And move on.
Exactly.
Thanks, Mark. Ted, you had a question you wanted to raise?
Actually, just an observation. I think one of the things that has come up in the discussion has been how things will change after this. And I'm just thinking in terms of social mores and customs that we have with one another, in terms of even shaking hands, hugging, kissing, a sign of peace, holding hands at the Lord's Prayer. Those kinds of things are, I mean, we've been shaped by this and frightened, I think, by some of that interaction. And I think that's one of the things we'll have to work through, but it certainly has been is shaping, I think, the way we're going to have that kind of interaction with one another going forward.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily have to become paranoid, but I think there will be an initial stage where we will be somewhat reticent, paranoid, and kind of feeling our way again out of our respective caves.
Yeah, I don't think there's just going to be a light switch one day and everything's going to go back to normal. I think, as Dr. Apache has said, what we're looking at here is, staging up and down as the need presents itself. Tom Ledbetter, you were going to chime in?
Yeah, I just want to go back to what Tracy and Mark were saying. I think it's right on target. And that is, if the cross is about anything, it's about vulnerability. And if we can learn that we're always vulnerable, and that the way of the cross is about vulnerability, and maybe we can learn that anew with this.
Thank you, Tom.
That's beautiful.
Mm.
Chris Mark, you had a question. Chris, I'm trying to unmute you. There you go.
Okay. I just wanted to point out we've been focusing pretty much entirely on the medical issue, the virus issue, and I just wanted to point out that what is coming down the pike is the economic catastrophe that's already beginning to unfold. We're seeing now conditions that hadn't been seen since the Great Depression. And so even if we are able to emerge from the virus quarantine in some way, we will probably be facing widespread and spreading poverty at levels we haven't experienced in our adult lives. I'm sort of recalling the stories that I heard from my parents and grandparents about the Depression years. Things we haven't seen. So I remember thinking how odd it seemed when they would talk about hobos. It was commonplace back in the 1930s. Well, we have somewhat different forms now, but I think we need to prepare our minds and our hearts for that, and how we in the community like ours can respond to that.
I think you're on, Chris. I do think economically we're going to be looking at a very different reality very soon. Leslie?
I just wanted to say in response to Chris, and then also I think Tom's comment, or no, it was Ted. I think one thing is to think about setting that example. So when it comes back to a time when we can hug people, that we have to have a bravery about doing those things, and still, wearing masks when we have potential respiratory problems, and being really diligent about hand washing. But I think maybe we need to, especially in our generation, to set that example that it's okay to do those kinds of things, to get back to that connection that Jackie needs, that I feel like I need. And then as to economics, I think we're the kind of community, from what I've seen in my short period of time, who will be there to help reach out. And then I think also using technology. I'm aware of so many GoFundMes and different methods of helping people. So I have faith that perhaps this humbling that we're all going through will allow us to become better brothers keepers. Just some thoughts.
I very much appreciate your raising the economic issues that are going to come down. And I think as I've been reflecting on it, that's almost even harder for me to anticipate than people getting sick, because it's not been part of the experience in my lifetime that we have such major economic devastation as some folks say is going to happen. And so I can conceptualize what it might be, but it's hard to internalize that. And I think here again is another example of we just have to trust and have faith that we will deal, and we'll deal as open-heartedly as we can, both within our community and within the larger extended community. But that's a hard one to anticipate, what that threat actually is to us.
Yeah, and I think the reality here is something that happens every day of our life, but perhaps in the normalcy we don't think about. But we are going to change. We have to change. That's part of life. We change every year. I mean, the hair gets thinner, the waist gets a little broader, but we change, and this experience will be something that changes us as well. Hopefully in some positive ways, as Leslie's talking about, you know, as we become leaders and people who embody hope and compassion in the midst of whatever economic struggles are just around the corner. So, all right, any last questions before I give Kathryn the last word? She was going to share an overview of the weeks that are ahead. But anybody else? Wave in front of the screen so I know. Not seeing anybody. So, Lady Kathryn?
Okay, you should be seeing my desktop, are you? Oops, let's go back to the first page. Whoop. Right there. So this is our schedule. We're at week number 1. Next week, we're going to talk about disconnection and aloneness. How do we deal with this? Maybe getting to Jackie's question a bit more. Tom Ledbetter is going to facilitate that meeting. Dealing with dark emotions, anger, grief, fear, and depression. Donna Ledbetter is going to help us with that one. Number 4 is how do we accept the unacceptable? Ted Olson's going to lead us in that. Number 5, what's normal anxiety? How do we keep it from becoming a major problem? Ted Wilson's going to lead that one. The next one is what's normal depression in difficult times? Maybe it's appropriate to be somewhat depressed because things are changing. There's a lot of uncertainty. But how do we keep it from becoming really problematic? Then I think an interesting one is number 7. What unique stressors might couples be experiencing at this time? And what kind of suggestions might there be to help all of us who are working with this? Tom and Donna Ledbetter are going to facilitate that. The 8th session is what issues might families be facing? A facilitator has yet to be confirmed for that. Number 9, how do we acknowledge and work with all of the disappointments, losses, and grief we may be feeling during this time? And last is how do we call upon our spiritual resources for support? And Carlisle Gill will be leading that session. So that's what we're thinking about doing. If you have any thoughts, please give us feedback. Our group is going to be meeting tomorrow to assess this session and to explore further where we want to go. But this is the general frame of reference that we're using. Any thoughts at this point about what we have in mind?
Thank you very much.
Are there any thoughts about this session? What's been useful, what's not?
I just want to say a word of thanks to Kathryn for being the sacrificial, for going first and helping us, take this first step forward in facilitating this conversation, and all of you for coming and helping and contributing your questions this evening. We're doing our best to try to maintain our connections and our relationships during this time, and we know that we are still church, even if we're not physically in the same building together. So any feedback though that you have, please feel free to send along to Kathryn or to me or to any of the other presenters you saw on her list. And we'll look forward to seeing you next Thursday night.
And thank you for your sharing.
Thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you, Kathryn.
All right.